Hello everyone, I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we are continuing with class number 15 of the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, as explained by Paramhansa Yogananda, as remembered by his disciple, Swami Kriyananda. And we are now up to chapter 2, verse 48. Our last session was almost entirely questions and answers, emailed or submitted during the course of the broadcast, so do feel free to go ahead with your questions in either form. We're always happy to have them. The point here is to actually learn the Bhagavad Gita, not just to run through it and say that we've read it. Okay, so chapter 2, number 48. O Dhananjaya, Arjuna, immerse yourself in the thought of yoga union with God, inwardly non-attached and even-minded, in both success and failure. Perfect evenness of mind and feeling is itself the definition of yoga. And then Swami goes on to comment that the only way to achieve this kind of calmness is through meditation. And he makes the interesting statement that affirmations of calmness in the midst of tension often just increase tension, which is an interesting comment. The only way you can be calm in the way that the Gita is really asking us to be is when our thoughts are actually controlled, and the methods of doing that primarily are in inward awareness. I wanted to spend a little time on these two words, simply non-attached and even-minded, because they appear all the way through yoga teaching, and it's a very important concept to grasp in the right way. And it's also related to Swami's comment about affirmations of calmness in the midst of tension are not really the same as having an inner state of awareness of a higher reality that allows us to relate to the ephemeral world, relatively speaking, comparatively ephemeral compared to the eternal, in the proper way. So often what happens in spiritual life is that people have an idea in their mind of what spirituality is supposed to look like. And so the yogi is non-attached and even-minded. So the novice practitioner tends to put that attitude on like a costume. And rather than it being a spontaneous expression of our inner awareness, we're just wearing it. In my experience with Swami Kriyananda over many years, among countless other progressions of deeper understanding of what a true sage really is, was this difference between disciplining yourself to have the right attitude and the right action, and actually shifting your inner consciousness so it was spontaneously the way that you saw the world. And several of the verses in the next few verses that are coming are all related to this. So let me start with this here. I'll give you one example of the difference between behavior and actual perception. And it was an experience that spanned actually a number of decades. When I met Swami Kriyananda, I was 22. And by the time I was 24, I was living where he was living, and I began to work closely with him. Swami was 22 years older than I believe, 21 years older. And he always was 21 years older. We never closed the gap in the way that those things work. And naturally, he had already, because he had become a disciple so young, and his guru had given him so much responsibility, and he was the founder of the community that I had just moved into. He was a world citizen. His upbringing had been so much broader than my own in countless ways. His experience was vast and mine was minuscule. I was still ridiculously confident in my own point of view and had a lot of force behind whatever I thought was true. And Swamiji, recognizing that I had more potential than actuality, wanted to encourage me in the hope that my potential would actually be realized. So he was very respectful, I would almost say ridiculously respectful of my point of view, just in order to help me to find my way, recognizing that eventually I would have a lot of responsibility, and he hoped that I would be able to carry it out ably. So time passed, decades passed, literally, and eventually I'm with my husband guiding the community that I live in still, the Ananda Palo Alto community where Swami Kriyananda has never lived, and his leadership has always been through us. He would visit often, but we were always in charge. Not more than him, but left to be in charge. And time passed, and pretty soon I was working with people who were 22, 25, 30 years younger than me. Strong-minded people, very opinionated, with lots of potential. My experience has never been as broad as Swami's, but I have had more experience in Ananda than some of the wonderful young people that I've worked with. And from time to time, the thought naturally arose when some person decades younger than me chronologically, younger than I am chronologically, there was a temptation to assert that fact as a way to get my own way. And when that temptation arose, it became very vivid in my mind what I had always known, but hadn't really focused in on, that Swamiji never, not once, never referred either to my chronological age or my inexperience. And when I realized that from a different perspective than the receiving end, I thanked him for it. And when I thanked him, he accepted my thanks graciously. But then I said, you never once made any reference to my age. And Swamiji said quite simply, I never noticed. He said the soul has no age. The body is a superficial and passing identification. The soul, everyone's soul is as old as God, is how he put it. We're all manifested from the divine in the same way. We all, in our essence, have the same divinity. So the bodies that we're wearing, it has nothing to do, really, with our spiritual advancement. And he said, I never define people in terms of their ages. He said, I just look into their eyes and through their eyes into their soul. He said, even children, I never think of them as children. And he did say, sometimes you have to relate appropriately. You have to relate appropriately to everyone according to who they are. And that may have to take into account the fact that it's only a child, and a child's interests are different. But he said, I never think of people that way. So in my own thinking, I realized how different that is. You know, I could decide on the right attitude and had enough willpower to carry out the right attitude quite cheerfully. But what Swamiji has always been working on is a completely different perception of reality in which your responses then are spontaneous and not calculated, but completely spontaneous based on your actual definition of reality and your experience of reality. So this word, especially the word non-attached, it's absolutely essential when we think about non-attachment. People think of non-attachment as meaning either indifference or lack of involvement or lack of commitment. Now, because I've seen Swamiji for so many years of his life, I have the picture in my mind of what a sage looks like. And then Swamiji would communicate to us what Master was like and taught us a lot about how the avatar acts in this world. And when you read books, there's a book by Durga Mata, which is called Trilogy of Divine Love. I'm not sure whether that's available in India or not, but you might look on Amazon and see if you can find it. Unfortunately, a lot of Master's more revealing communications, letters to Rajasi, letters to Dr. Lewis, two of his very important disciples, are not as readily available as they should be. Because when they are, you see the only thing I can describe is the passion with which Master approached his mission for God, and the unremitting determination that he exercised in the carrying out of that mission. I mean, just for example, when Master arrived in America in 1920, I mean, very soon after a few years, as he put it, of getting used to the American temperament, he started traveling in America. America's a very large country, and he just crisscrossed the United States back and forth, lecturing night after night, giving classes and free programs to literally thousands of people, just working without stopping. And in his letters to his disciples, he would say, I barely sleep, I write books in the evening, I counsel, I write letters, and then I give these classes and I meet with disciples. And just the energy he poured into it, it was the exact opposite of uncommitted or uninvolved. And even his own poem, when he writes about being God's boatman, I believe it's in that one, where he says he will return to this world, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times if necessary, with bleeding feet across crags of suffering, is how he describes it. He will return as long as one stray brother is left behind. Now, this is how a fully self-realized master behaves. How do we reconcile that with non-attached? Even how do we reconcile that with even-minded? But non-attached is what we're thinking about now. His non-attachment was not because he wouldn't give his whole heart, body, mind, and soul, really, to what he was doing. Now, if you want to think of it, what we're trying to do is we're trying to emulate the divine. This is what the Gita is showing us. How do we become one with God? If we're going to become one with God, we have to act in this world, and it's a little hard to get your mind around, but think of it like this, in the way that God acts. Of course, we see God's action through his God-realized saints, and I speak of Master in this way and Swami Kriyananda also. And the energy and the dedication and the creative intelligence that they apply to the project of bringing God consciousness to others. And I was starting to say, if you think of God in this world, he's anything but uninvolved and anything but uncommitted. Everything about creation is the determination of the divine to create for us a perfect learning ground. And as we progress through this group of slokas here, we'll see it's a perfect learning ground. And just look at us. Look how deeply involved we are in the lives that God has given us. This is God's energy working through us. So non-attached has to mean something else other than uninvolved. Well, I'll give you an example from my own life in which I did learn the difference, a very serious difference between non-attached and uninvolved. I was given the assignment with several other friends of mine to work for a while on the project of making our main community in America, Ananda village, to have it legally recognized as a California city. I mean, a legal entity, a municipal entity. Now, for those of you who've seen Ananda village, it's a rural community of a few hundred people. It looks nothing like a city. It looks a little like an Indian village, but not even much like that. It's very small. But because of the way the American laws were written, it was possible for our community to qualify as a California city. The whole purpose of doing this was so that we would have more control and less government interference in the way our community developed. A city is the only entity that has control of its own land use. without going into all of the complexities of zoning in the particular county of California that we're in, it seemed like a really good idea to declare our independence from all that government involvement and how it gave our neighbors power over us and various things. It was a project that I and others worked on for 18 months. It became an extremely contentious project because many people in the local area wanted to have direct control over how Ananda developed, and it was perfectly clear to them what we were trying to do. Not that we ever did anything that actually was against their interests, but the way people perceive things is not always accurate. So it was a very contentious project, and I was utterly single-minded on this. I thought about it day and night because it wasn't just a practical problem, it was an energetic problem. We had to assert our magnetism. Now, whether or not that was desirable to do is the end of this story. But we had to assert our magnetism, and I was the prow of that ship. And we went through public hearing after public hearing, and each one was increasingly contentious and larger, until in the little town where we were, the last hearing, there were more than 800 people there, almost 1,000 people. It went on until 2 in the morning. It was an adventure. In the end, they voted against us, the government board that made the decision. But we felt that they had not acted within the boundaries of the law. And we vowed that night, in front of the television cameras that had come to see us, that we were going to take this into the courts and that our rights had been violated and we were going ahead. And you know, I'm rather good at that sort of thing. I have a lot of revolution in my past incarnations, and it doesn't take much for me to go back there again. With more even-minded and cheerful attitude, but nonetheless, there I was. The next morning, unbeknownst to me, Swami Kriyananda meditated on what we ought to do, whether in fact, even if the process had been unfair, that God's true will had been expressed in thwarting our intentions. And he felt, as he put it later to me, to his surprise, he felt Master say to him, enough, don't go any farther, just drop it at this point. At that time at Ananda, there were no telephones or email hadn't been invented, and so there was no communication. And a television crew was coming up from a local city, from Sacramento, the state capital actually, and I was to meet that television crew at the entrance to our community and go the mile through the rural community to Swami Kriyananda's house, where there was going to be an interview, I thought, about our determination to go forward. So all the way up in the car, I'm talking to the reporters about how our cause is righteous and their process was flawed and we're not going to give up like this. We get to Swamiji's house, and Swamiji immediately says to the reporters, if you give me a few extra minutes, I have a real scoop for you, is exactly how he put it. I had no idea what he was talking about. And I turned to one of my friends who'd been with Swamiji waiting for the reporters. I whispered, what is he talking about? And my friend, with horror in his face, said, equally in the stage whisper, you don't know? No, I don't know. And he just was silent. So Swami sits down and starts reading this prepared statement. I'm a wordsmith. I hear all the nuances of words. From the first sentence, Swamiji is talking about the project in the past tense. From the first sentence, I can tell that the project is over. So Swami reads that, and he reads a very thoughtful statement about the, in America, church and state are quite separate. Religion and government, they try to keep it separate. It's disintegrated a lot. In fact, Swamiji's statement was very predictive of some of the trouble that America and other countries are in right now when religion and politics get too close together. So Swami says that he decided that even though the process was flawed, the result was correct. And that, as he put it, an organization constituted for one purpose, in this case spiritual, corrupts itself when it becomes involved in something that was constituted for other reasons, which is why church and state are separate in America, and why he thought Ananda should not, in fact, be a California city, even though it had been. We had worked on it all that time. So now, they immediately turned the camera on me, because I, minutes before, have been saying something completely opposite. So they turned the camera on me, and I have to, with this great, thank God, gift of gab I have, think really fast. I had about 2 minutes to gather my thoughts because I was listening to Swamiji, and talk about, yes, and I just endorsed everything he said and added a few creative thoughts of my own. Then we left, and I have to drive all the way back out down the hill, now telling the reporters exactly why we're not going on. I thought about it later. These cameramen work in our state capitol, and they're always dealing with politicians, and they didn't even seem to notice that I had just flipped my position. Why not? Just flip your position. So I flipped it. I took them, I said goodbye. I get back in the car, I drive back to Swami's house, I knock on his door, and it's like, what? What? You know, I wasn't upset with him. It was just like, he was laughing, I was laughing. He said, there was no way to get in touch with you. There was no way I could tell you. And he looked a little impish. I think a small part of him enjoyed it. But he said, I was meditating this morning. I asked Master what we should do, and as Swamiji said, I was as surprised as you are. But I felt him emphatically say, enough. You've accomplished a great deal by this effort, but it's not going to be the right thing if you succeed. And essentially, that's why Master blocked it. And here's another interesting point. Swami said to me, did you ask Master if we should continue? I said, no, sir, I just assumed it. And he sort of smiled, and he just said, well, like that. And I, of course, he was completely right. I had just assumed it, that what was true yesterday was true today. So we laughed, we talked it out, it was fine. I really didn't mind at all. One, of course, completely trusted Swamiji's point of view. He had been more attentive to God's guidance than I was being. And I didn't mind. It was an unpleasant project. I was happy to be done with it. But it was very interesting to me because, you see, I got to find out what was I committed to and what was I attached to. And I was pleased to realize that I was committed to doing what Master wanted us to do to build this community. And Master's guidance came to me mostly through Swamiji, also in my own heart, but also through Swamiji. If my perception contradicted his, I would always work with him for me to try to understand why there was a contradiction. And always in my life I have found that if Swamiji contradicted what I thought, it was because my point of view was not broad enough. Believe me, I did not come to that, effortlessly, but I've come to it absolutely. So in this case, there was no question in my mind. And so I got to find out what I was committed to. And I was committed to doing God's will. As long as I felt that what I was doing was God's will, there was no limit to how much energy I would put behind it. Now think about that. If what you're doing is God-given for you as your duty, you must be involved in it. You must be committed to it. How can you be half committed to what God has asked you to do? And that's just simply the way that we have to live in this world. Otherwise, we gain nothing. But as soon as I understood that God's will had shifted, and God's will is a moving target, and this is where attachment versus non-attachment and working for the fruits and other things that come soon after this verse really get us into trouble. I am attached to doing God's will, but I live in this world with complete non-attachment to every other thing. As long as it's God's will, I do it completely. As soon as I understand it to be over, then my attachment has only been to God's will. So in this case, I had to just 18 months of absolute effort just stopped and had to be dropped, just like that. And I did it very fast, except, and this was amusing to me, I came back to Swami's house by the end of that day and said, I don't really mind losing, but it annoys me that our opponents won. So I was still attached to them losing, which was a subtle nuance of it, which is they had annoyed me, and I didn't want them to get their way. But then actually, interestingly, I got very sick. I got a high fever. And after the fever was gone, I didn't care anymore. I was perfectly happy for them to get their way. It's all God's universe. What difference does it make? So you see, that's the non-attachment we're talking to. We're deeply committed to what the divine gives us to do. So if that is to build a business to support your family, if that is to marry and have children, if it's to take care of your parents, if it's to fulfill a creative inspiration that's given to you, if it's to pursue God, if it's to become a renunciate or at least a dedicated devotee and to practice sadhana, we can't be non-attached to those things. They're God-given commissions. But we're not doing them for their own sake. We're doing them because it's the job that God has given us to do. And we're attached, deeply attached, to doing His will. You see the difference? And then also you see, we can be even-minded in this world because our sense of value, of self-worth, is not what we've made happen in the world, but the fact that we have sincerely connected ourselves to following God's guidance. And we follow that guidance with our whole hearts. And then when that guidance shifts, or when the result of that guidance is different than we expected, then we're even-minded just the same, because what we're doing is different than what the worldly mind perceives. Now, that doesn't mean that at the first obstacle we give up or we cheerfully don't care, because obstacles are the way we train ourselves. Because what every assignment in this world is really about, no matter what it looks like or what it appears to be on the outside, it's training our courage, it's training our willpower, our determination, our creativity, our willingness to open our hearts and to love as God loves, and to learn unconditional love and perfect acceptance and non-attachment. And these are the lessons that we're here to learn, and we can't learn them if at the first sign of trouble we back up. Swamiji talked about a time when he was in the early years of building Ananda, which has now become this worldwide spiritual source of inspiration. But when he was beginning, it was just one rural community, the very community that I was trying to make into a California city. But he only had a handful of supporters. He didn't have the hundreds of people committed to it as he does now. And at the beginning, it was largely a matter of money. And Swami came from a comfortable home, but his parents never endorsed his project. His father particularly never endorsed it, and therefore never supported it. And everything to make the project work at the beginning was the result of Swami's extraordinary hard work and just earning the money. And he got trapped by some unscrupulous business people with whom he had an agreement about certain monies that were owed. But because there was no contract, the businessman tried instead to repossess Swami's land. And suddenly, Swami was faced with the necessity. He was making just enough money, literally every month. He would have pennies in his bank account after all the bills were paid, including his obligation to this particular businessman for an outstanding balance. And that businessman suddenly just said, oh, you have to pay it all, and you have to pay it within 30 days or 60 days, whatever it was, or else I'm going to take your property as collateral that, is owed to me. And Swamiji, he said he was just shaking, with the intensity of the threat that had suddenly been raised against this project. And he said he was driving in the car with a friend, and he was driving, and he said his hands were like this. And it was a woman, and she said, well, come to my house and have a cup of tea, that'll make you feel better. And Swami's response, he would have none of it. He said, I don't care how I feel. He said, I have to figure out what I'm going to do about this. He was absolutely committed and even-minded in the sense of undeterred. He wasn't going to go and sort of sit with a cup of tea and think about how miserably God had treated him. It was, I've committed to do this, it's going to be done, and now I have to solve the problem. He was intense, but that's not the same. You understand? He was very forceful, and sometimes people also imagine that even-minded means that you're always kind of have this kind of limp smile on your face. That's not true at all. It means that you're not deterred. You remain even in your determination. You are not discouraged. Now I want to balance that, because now, having said that all of these conditions in our life are to train us in these qualities that are the essential qualities for realizing God. You see, our external commitments in this world are like the gymnasium in which our consciousness is trained, because the conditions of the world come and go. I mean, not only does the planet constantly shift, but when we die, it's all gone. The houses we've built, the businesses we've developed, the children we've raised, they're all part of the identification with this particular incarnation, this particular body. When that body dies, all those identifications in that form, the connections with people, the love relationships remain, but the form changes. And we go into our essential essence, our essential divine essence, in the astral world with the astral ego still. But what we have is our consciousness. In other words, the power of concentration and of willpower and of being even-minded and being attached to God but not attached to the world, all of that stays with us very strongly. So that's really what we're doing. That's really what we're doing. But we have to do it wholeheartedly. But we were working once with Swamiji, and this was in an effort to build one of our first urban centers. This was in the city of San Francisco. And Swamiji was spent much time in that first year, when that project was really being launched. And he was giving a lot of classes and programs. And those of us who were in charge of organizing and publicizing were not always as skillful or as committed or as energetic as Swami himself was. And he gave a certain program, and we had advertised it incorrectly. And as a result, he drove an hour or an hour and a half to give this program, and there were just a few people there. The turnout was just not at all what it should have been. And one of the devotees, in an effort to sort of diffuse the sense of anxiety and guilt that we were all feeling, said, oh, maybe Divine Mother, let's see, let me just think how it was said exactly. Maybe this is just what Divine Mother wanted, that you should come all this distance and there should be nobody in the class. And Swamiji looked at the devotee and he said like this, please, he said, allow a little room for human error, just like that. And it was perfect, because we have to be, non-attachment does not mean indifferent. And especially, we can't be non-attached to the point that we don't learn what we're trying to learn, that we don't put out the energy. And then later he said, he explained it like this. He said, if Divine Mother, and he was specifically talking about the project we were engaged in, trying to establish this house in San Francisco, this center for Ananda. He said, if Divine Mother made it impossible, that would be no problem. We would just pack up and go home. Meaning, if it was clearly not God's will, then we're only attached to God's will. We're not attached to founding this house. He said, and we would just let go. The problem is, he said, Divine Mother makes it barely possible. And then we just have to keep pushing and keep pushing. And in fact, in the end, we succeeded. The collective we. I wasn't part of it after that, after the very beginning. But he said we succeeded very well because we were committed. But we were non-attached in the sense that we remained even-minded. When things didn't go as they were supposed to go, it's just one more thing to do. Mother Teresa of Calcutta became very well known because of her selfless service to the poor. And in the West especially, also in the East of course, but in the West, much of the definition of Christianity is helping the poor and the downtrodden. The inner communion aspect of Christianity has not been as visible for some centuries as it should be. In fact, a good part of Master's mission to the West is to restore that understanding of inner communion. But in any case, Mother Teresa is highly revered because of her tremendous work with the poor. But it's very interesting, and sometimes journalists they feel obligated to be confrontive, and it's very hard to be confrontive when you're dealing with the saints. So they found this way to be confrontive, and they said something to Mother Teresa about, your way of helping the poor is not nearly as efficient as the government's. They do a lot more good for the poor than you do. What do you think about that? And Mother Teresa said, I'm not helping the poor. She said, I'm doing what Jesus asked me to do. And then she just left it. I don't really think the reporter understood the difference. Because you see, Mother Teresa received a direct call from Jesus. Jesus, her guru, Jesus, her Ishtadeva. God's voice to her. Jesus said to her, work with the poorest of the poor, help them. But she was doing what Jesus asked her to do, which meant that if Jesus asked her to do something else, she would turn her back on the poorest of the poor, and she wouldn't think about them again. I don't mean that in any callous way, but it's the will of God that we're following. And that's where a non-attachment, and that's where even-mindedness comes from. So when he says, and I'll read it again, O Dhananjaya, immerse yourself in the thought of yoga, which is union with God, inwardly non-attached and even-minded, in both success and failure. Perfect evenness of mind and feeling is itself the definition of yoga. The definition of yoga, which, as he says here, immerse yourself in the thought of yoga, which is to say, immerse yourself in union with God. And then, non-attached and even-minded in success or failure, because we're doing the will of God. We have to allow in the will of God a little space for human error, which allows us to develop the qualities of perseverance and willpower. That is the entire purpose of human life. Success or failure in this world, in this world's terms, is not how God sees it. God sees how deeply did we love, how much did we cling and immerse ourselves in the thought of the divine. That's what success or failure is. And going back to my saying, it's one thing to understand what the right attitude is, and it's definitely beneficial to discipline yourself to have it. But what we're really wanting to do is to change our perception. Immersed in the thought of God, it's easy to be both committed and even-minded and non-attached, because God is the same. Whether we're succeeding or failing is not the way the divine measures us. Insofar as God measures us at all, it's how much do you love? And above all, how much do you love God? And if you love God, you love everything He gives you to do equally, because it's all a gift from Him. And behind it you see God's hand. And when you see that, then it is your perception, not your affirmation that you're offering. Now, let me just make sure there. And this is where Swami says also in the commentary on this, that he speaks of calming the thoughts in meditation, which is, that's when we immerse ourselves in the thought of God, is when we specifically practice that one-pointed concentration. Of course, the more deeply we practice that in meditation, the more easy it is to carry it over into everything else that we do. But if we don't bring our attention and our awareness into that state of detached from this world calmness, then it's very difficult to also live it in the world. So then we come to this beginning of the extremely famous teachings here, Nishkama karma, action without desire for the fruits of action. So this is chapter 2, verse number 49. Action performed with desire for the fruits is greatly inferior to action guided by wisdom. Therefore, O Dhananjaya, seek in everything to be guided by wisdom. And then he says, misery attends actions performed for their fruits. Krishna was very energetic here. He didn't merely say it doesn't work as well. He says misery. If you're attached to the results of what you're doing, if you're acting only for what you think that's going to bring you, then misery is the result. It's really a marvelous statement. I remember a particular incident. Well, let me sit with this for a moment. As I was saying earlier, the duties that God assigns us are not for the sake of those duties. They're for the sake of our attunement with the divine. And sometimes you feel that divine guidance powerfully and inwardly, and sometimes you simply find yourself surrounded with responsibilities. But thinking back to my experience with the effort to make Ananda California City, Swamiji, as a long habit in life, did not merely assume now that this great force of energy had been directed at our project. He didn't merely assume that we should just power through that opposition. He very sensitively stopped and immersed himself again in the thought of the divine and asked again, what is being asked of me? What is my duty here? Is my duty mere lack of perseverance, or is my duty to understand now that something new is being asked of me? And as long as we are always asking if this is what God wants, even if the result is disastrous from an external point of view, if we inwardly feel the divine presence, it makes no difference. We're even-minded in success and failure, just as he asks us to be here. So action performed with desire for the fruits is greatly inferior to action guided by wisdom. It's the guidance by wisdom that we're looking for. So seek in everything that we do to be guided by wisdom, not merely by desire that things come out in a certain way. I remember when there was a particular project that I was working on, and there were several of us in charge sequentially. And the first person who carried out the event, it was a series of events, and I was in charge of the second or third in the cycle. And the first was very successful. And when I came on, and my only excuse is this was very early in my spiritual life, my competitive instinct kicked in. And I very much wanted to be as successful with the event that I was responsible for as my predecessor had been. And unfortunately, I was more interested in that result than I was merely in doing it because it was the right thing to do, or doing it just for the sheer joy of it. It was a public event, sharing with many people, and with a lot of good work with a lot of friends. And I took all that on also. But in the back of my mind, I was competing with another person. And I wanted to be as good as that other person. And as a consequence, I failed to assess the marketplace, is the only way I can say it. And I failed to attune my ideas to what people really wanted. And as a result, I was not as successful as my predecessor. I was dramatically less successful. I carried out the project successfully, but the public response was not what we had hoped for. And afterwards, when I was sitting with Swamiji, because thank God he knew I would be receptive, he just smiled at me and pointed out to me my earlier decisions. And he could read my mind. And he said, whenever your ego gets involved, Asha, you make terrible decisions. And it was so, again, he was just telling me the truth. I don't even remember being chagrined. It was just true. I had gotten into my head that I needed to show off. And once I had gotten into my head that I needed to show off, every decision after that, my judgment was very poor. I was not guided by wisdom. And so whenever we feel that in ourselves, I was completely attached to a particular outcome. And I was so determined to make that outcome that I was blinded. On another occasion, it was very interesting. I was visiting Swamiji in India, and this was not so long ago, well, maybe 10 years. But I was visiting Swamiji in India, and I was staying in his house, and I don't think I had any particular job to do. But nonetheless, because I was staying in his house, my time was very taken up by the events of the house. Swamiji shared a house at that time with a number of others. And there was a lot that was happening, and our time was very, very taken up. And I did not have my own car or my own driver. And at the same time, there were certain stores I really liked to visit in India. I really liked to shop at these certain stores. And I had seen them at a glance, traveling when I'd gone through with others. And I really wanted to go back and have a time to buy things, to try things on, to look for presents, to just do this shopping. And I managed, with great effort, to get everything all set up, that I had this period of time. I'd arranged for the car and the driver, and I was going to go out and I was going to get to fulfill my desires. And I was so fixed from the time I woke up that morning to fulfilling those desires. And I did. I was able to go shopping and fulfill those desires. But in the course of the day, I made so many other mistakes. And in fact, really big mistakes. I mean, mistakes that were so uncharacteristic of me that rebounded back on Swamiji and actually created misunderstandings and hurt feelings that actually literally took several years to unravel. And when the evening came and I was sitting at the dinner table with Swamiji, and the repercussions of my actions were just beginning to sort of like a tsunami kind of roll over Swamiji and over a number of others, and dissonant feelings, it was impressive. And I knew exactly what had happened. I had woken up with this desire for something I wanted. My ego had become involved, and I made a series of terrible decisions. And Swamiji was so sweet about it. I said, Swamiji, my only thought today was to get to the mall so I could go shopping. And I said, my desires completely clouded my judgment all day. I said, you have to be very, very careful, don't you, sir? And he just said, yes. just like that. And even though it was a mess for him, he was very kind to me about it because I had made a mistake and I just accepted it completely. I had a desire for a particular result. I was completely attached to the results of my own actions. And as a result, it was a mess. And there you have it. Whenever your ego gets involved, in other words, whenever your desires get involved, I don't like the word ego all that much because our ego is always involved. Our ego is the infinite identified with this particular body and this particular incarnation. So you really can't get away from ego per se. But what Swamiji meant by that is when your pride in yourself, your desires, your determination to have things come out a certain way for your self-aggrandizement or your pleasure, then these are not wisdom-guided decisions. And misery is the result. And it's just a simple fact. And experiment with it. I tell these stories because they're vivid in my experience, and they're very strong warnings for me, because you get sensitive to that feeling. You get sensitive to when the tape in your mind is all about how everybody's going to be really impressed, by how successful you were, or how much you're going to enjoy wearing this particular dress, or how people are going to think you're so sensitive and look at the great presents you picked out for them. Just all of these different things that are playing in your mind that are not wisdom guided, but they're all, I want things to turn out a certain way because of the way it's going to reflect on me. Well, in a few minutes, and it may be in our next session, we'll talk a little bit about divine law and the way God has arranged things so that we can have experiences that show us where true happiness lies. The only reason these things happen to us is because we are having to be educated about the way we are made. We're just like little children. Little children don't understand how things work. They don't know that they're hungry. They don't know that they're cold. They don't know that their body needs to eliminate. They don't know those things. They're just having all these sensations and they don't know what they mean. And they don't know how best to deal with them. They don't understand, and so they have a certain number of experiences that teach them, exactly like us. It's just the learning has no end point. The potential learning is infinite. It's not just a question of learning to feed our bodies. It's a question of living in the bliss of our own nature. So number 2, chapter 2, number 50. One who lives united to cosmic wisdom passes beyond the effects of both virtue and vice, even while living in the body. Therefore, devote yourself through wisdom to achieving the oneness of yoga. Such alone is right action. What we have to understand is spirituality does not, Sri Yukteswar put it this way. He said, saintliness is not dumbness. He said it's not, and in Autobiography of a Yogi, it's a very interesting balance, and I'm not going to be able to finish today, so I'm just going to start it a little bit. In Autobiography of a Yogi, Master explains to us that the training he received from Sri Yukteswar, his guru, Sri Yukteswar he describes as extremely strict. But most of the training that Master said he received from Sri Yukteswar was how to behave. He said his guru seldom, and perhaps never, I don't know, corrected Master spiritually. But as Master put it, he had picked up along the way the misunderstanding that if he was a spiritual person, he didn't have to be attentive or careful in the ways of the world. And there's a chapter in Autobiography of a Yogi, The Great Cauliflower Robbery, in which Master's carelessness in failing to lock the back door of the ashram caused him to lose one of his prize homegrown cauliflowers that he had brought as a gift for his guru. And you should read the whole story yourself. I won't go into it. But Master was always being taught by his master, Sri Yukteswar, to be fully awake and attentive in this world, and to do everything he did with full concentration and intelligence. And that's where Sri Yukteswar said, saintliness is not dumbness. You know, spiritual perception awakens in you the keenest of intelligence. And so this can often lead to the misunderstanding that therefore the measure of spirituality is worldly success. And especially in the West, there's this whole spiritual movement called the we can have it all spiritual movement, where we get to be rich and famous and beautiful and adored by other people and also spiritual. There was a man who was particularly awful in this respect as a so-called, I'll put teacher in quotes. And we used to characterize his teaching was, do anything you want to do, and then just call it spiritual. And that's not exactly how it works. Because what we're really trying to do, and this is what I was speaking of before, is that our real duty is to perceive the divine reality behind everything that we do. And then our decisions and our wisdom and our right actions come from that actual perception. So he says we move beyond the effects of both virtue and vice, even while still in the body. When we achieve oneness in yoga, that is right action. By virtue and vice, he didn't mean that we become evil. He just meant the fluctuating ups and downs of this world, which is the way the world behaves toward us, and that we become immune to those waves. We ride the even spirit of the divine. What we're doing is we're not necessarily separating ourselves from the world, but we are no longer identifying with the world. That's what our duty is. Our duty is to identify always with the divine to such an extent that no matter what happens in this world, that identification remains. When Swami Kriyananda was talking to Master once about the many incarnations that Master had had prior to being Yogananda, which included being William the Conqueror and a great king in Spain and many positions of great worldly power and even aggressive worldly actions seemingly. Swamiji said to Master, he said, Master, when you're living an incarnation like that, how does it feel, essentially? Are you identified? Are you involved? And Master responded, inwardly, you are always free. And that perfectly defines it. Inwardly, we are always free. No matter what God asks us to do, inwardly, we are always free. Well, that brings us to the end of this hour, and we'll continue with this verse and the ones that follow in our next session. God bless you.